Even in Newton's time, the approach to science was comprehensive. This meant that knowledge was not divided into objects as it is today, but objects were combined into blocks, so that thanks to all-encompassing knowledge, people had a comprehensive understanding of the world. It's completely different these days. Specializations have emerged. Western civilization praises analysis at the expense of synthesis, and mechanism at the expense of the organism. Thanks to this, a lot of competing, even fighting each other, so-called fields, or disciplines, which often come from the same stem, have arisen. Each of these disciplines has become a form of worship. People who are blind follow lepers and what a given person has said, provided that he really has a perfect publicity. It is safe to say that every scientific discipline has turned into a kind of cult, ruled by its own priests, guided by its own theology and doing everything to attract the faithful. Art, science, and especially medicine, sports, psychology, and history became new forms of worship. And this new clergy uses its secret lingo to give itself authority, and the common man understood little of it, for only thus would the faithful follow blindly. What's worse, those who don't follow trends are equal to heretics today. A new world and new, very dangerous religions. Why dangerous? Because in the hands of people who really think they are gods. Of course, believers largely contribute to their belief in it. Yes, often sociopaths or so-called robotic people are behind it. They have sacrificed everything for science and will not count on anyone or anything to prove their thesis. One of the first such people was Joseph Mengele. History is today the most manipulated humanistic science. This is due to the fact that you can publish anything, but the publishing market will be most pleased with shocking theses, because this book will sell. It doesn't have to be true, it must bring the cash. The sale is important. Scientific circles are not sacred in this matter. Medicine has always been steeped in a cult, but now it has really become dangerous. Like Napoleon, we should ask, how many patients have you killed? Then go to the doctor. This is due not only to the evil dealings of pharmaceutical companies, which no longer sponsor only expensive trips or vehicles for prescribed drugs, but thanks to fragmentation. Doctors do not look at the patient in general. The effect is that a patient, sometimes with a trivial disease, or a serious one, but with various symptoms, is referred from specialist to specialist. He receives further doses of medication, but he still feels bad and no one knows what's wrong with him. And they won't know, because they simply have knowledge about your body. Is it worth going to specialists? Let's say honestly, it's risky, especially these days. An ancient saying used to say that the name Hippocrates also means a hypocrite, and you won't find a more greedy one than a doctor. Doctors will not fight to change this system, on the contrary, it is convenient for them. Oh, come on, for some genetic diseases it is best to provide them with your own father's corpse. Then they will discover that the fact that you felt bad was genetic. People who have always sought authority or alpha leaders in the herd are now faced with a bewildering tangle of warring absolutes. And each priest imposes his interpretation of reality on them, which of course is the only correct one. Of course, people will choose the current that seems to them the safest, read closest to their views, but it's worse if other, more dangerous theses are hidden under this guise. In fact, nowadays practically every sphere of life works a bit like a sect. It is very dangerous. One day, it will turn against all of us, because the faithful will start to defend their priests not only with words, but also with swords. Robert Musil once wrote that we live in a relativism of perspective teetering on the brink of epistemological panic. People live in panic all the time and are bombarded even by the news in order to stay in it. Yes, such a nation will not rise up against the authority, even if it is weak, but everyone can be manipulated by it. Quite recently you could see what Musil wrote about in that wise words. Panic created a pandemic, though fewer died than in the plague, cholera, and Spanish flu pandemics. The numbers were specially manipulated. And no one even hid it, but people were so bombarded with death that seeing these numbers they were horrified. The problem is that these numbers were not taken in relation to the entire human population. That's why you can't even talk about a pandemic. People did not lie side by side in their houses and on the streets. As with the plague, when there was often no one to bury the corpse. Now such a panic is the situation in Ukraine, although no one mentions Sudan. Too far. However, more goods are exported from Niger, so everything will be done to keep a hand there. That's another deception. Psychology in business. That is, simply calling manipulation in business by its name. What businessmen are so offended by. Let us take, for example, concepts such as ethos, logos, pathos. The problem is that Aristotle in rhetoric wrote about the common good in the state, not about marketing. Such good ideas and assumptions have been twisted and turned into something not so good. Business has manipulated many concepts, and there is no human in it. There are numbers. In one thing you can agree with Marx, and that's probably why the Americans, not just those from USA, hates this philosophy so much, because they would finally have to give some kind of social security to their citizens. Besides, every capitalist hates it. It is, but it applies only to the rich, selected professional groups. The cleaning lady does not pay contributions. Not because he can choose. This assumption is very good. Because she can't afford it. It's already bad. We were supposed to get manpower, and people came. Capitalists like Ford are a distortion in one direction, like Marx in the other, but here he just said something wise. Living beings are not manpower. Force is Newton. Possibly power, watt, not volt, and applies to machines. We can thank Descartes, Voltaire, and Hume for the fragmentation of knowledge. In fact, the era of the Enlightenment, which recognized skepticism as the most perfect intellectual model. It was then that dangerous theses appeared that the world, people and animals are mechanisms. Let us thank Descartes for that. Unfortunately, if due to the fact that the Germans distorted this concept to the limit and indeed showed the world that people are machines during World War II. We can do whatever we want with them, because we are gods they machine. Yes, in the case of animals, unfortunately, there is still a cult of the theory that they are machines. Here again the SS must be blamed, because the only behaviorists who wrote the truth about animals, their feelings, way of thinking, were SS men. No one will print them for what they did. So it's better to follow American lepers perverted by post-Protestant sects. There is nothing in the Bible about the inferiority of animals. And about man's domination of the world. Management is not reign. The translation so adapted by the authorities influenced the fate of the animals. While for a Christian before that era, man was not an inseparable part of nature, he became nature and, what is worse, he received a redeemed soul. Nature, on the other hand, has an irredeemable character. They refer here to the redemption of sins, but the Bible talks about everyone, not just people. And when we look at this world, we have doubts about salvation. Nature in the Bible is not at all subordinated to human. It has been doing so gradually since the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment will seal it. The Bible does not deify nature and does not nag the natural world into machines. However, this fragment has become really convenient for people. People seem to have always had a complex that they are not equal to God. This mistranslated fragment gave them that power. However, they never received it. In that case we are worser than Lucifer, we stole it. The worst thing that happened to the human soul is Freud, although some will probably squeal. Freud brought the soul into the machine. Let me remind you that his teachings are theses. In many issues he was more wrong than Pavlov. People have felt so godlike that they have to give everything a name. Recently they change them and give dimension. We have time zones, often not adequate to real time, which means that the sun shines in our windows all summer and even air conditioning is not able to cool the rooms. People hate when things get out of control, it immediately becomes chaos. The problem is that the world is really chaos. They will go to the couch, someone will tell them how to live with it. All mathematics is a false and conventional science. It's a deal. In the real world, 2 + 2 can also equal 5 or 30. Someone called it that, and the rest like Pavlov's dogs follow it. These are conventions, not absolute truths, although we've been told otherwise for hundreds of years. The most interesting convention of recent years is the factor of well-being, praised by influencers, politicians and journalists as the Holy Grail. Of course, this is a return to the beginnings of Nazism. Of course everyone should do what these priests tell them, but the problem is that for each person something will make you feel better. The question is, do we want to be a copy or ourselves? In recent years, 3 grams ultrasound has become very fashionable, which is supposed to be a reliable prenatal examination. Poorer countries stop there, starting with the fact that ultrasound is not a precise examination. It never was. Everyone who graduated from photography also had this device and can say something about it. It's better to take an equally inadequate X-ray, but more adequate. Genetics is so cool that some diseases will only come to light at the time of birth. Even the famous hypertrichosis, which is not a genetic defect at all, so no one sees it. This is how we all look like in the womb. At the time of birth, the baby's body should receive information that it is going out and the hair should falling out. We've made it very simple for the layman. They simply did not receive this information. We have a fur. And without that fur, we would have disintegrated alive in our mothers' bellies. So everyone can born like that. Just luck. Why are all these new cults fighting religion so much? Religion has not always acted morally in history. People have distorted the message of the prophets, even when it was perfect. However, religion was still a barrier after all. Reference. Precisely because for centuries it has indicated what is good and what is bad. God and Lucifer. That's not to say it wasn't doing something wrong for political purposes, but people had a stable relationship thanks to religion. By destroying religions, people will not have it. There will be even greater numbers of manipulative slaves. They will indeed be able to do with us what they will, and we will go along with it, okay, but the Protestant churches, apart from the Anglican ones, very quickly lost their attention. They had nothing to draw people to these empty walls. This purification has led people to give up listening to it. Human needs aesthetic experiences, church should give it, not be a hospital. You don't have it in those buildings. In Scandinavia, this fell on very dissolute societies. Hearing about hell all the time, and the notion that you're inherently evil, there's no chance of salvation. They pushed away the faithful themselves, with dogma. It had to happen there. Science has known evil and has become evil. This phrase is attributed to Oppenheimer. After his, Rotblat and Stanislaus Ulam's invention fell on Nagasaki. I don't know how the movie shows it, but it's a really interesting juxtaposition of two attitudes. Ulam is a scientist reproached with all feelings. The invention was successful. It's great. Oppenheimer, on hearing what his invention was used for, fell into depression. Few people know that after what happened Oppenheimer tried to commit suicide. He had several such draws in his life. Oppenheimer credited the invention of the bomb with his name, but he did not work on it alone. It was a huge staff of people. Specially selected. People who consider themselves gods, some sociopaths. Many of them were Jews, because it was well known that they might feel a desire for revenge. Many did not know what they were working on. The only difference was that Oppenheimer had access to the elites and known the Germans. Oppenheimer knew the attitude of the Japanese as well. It was the greatest clash between these nations during war. It was a kind of revenge on the part of the Ohm, but not on those who needed it. The Japanese saw them as talented and well-educated useful people. The bomb was a kind of show of American power. They needed it to establish their military supremacy and start to count on the international arena. This country has always had complexes about Europe and its short history. It was not needed, because Japan already had pacification treaties prepared. Japanese visas from Kaunas saved the lives of many Jews, Poles, and White Guardsmen. And there's no way the Japanese government didn't know it, and neither did Stalin. They turned a blind eye because they considered the practice of the Germans to be bad. It seems that Oppenheimer had no idea that it would indeed be dropped in that place. The bomb was meant to hit the Arsenal Castle, Osaka and Kokura-jo, not the cities they were described latter. For a long time it was argued that this was a mistake. The fact that hydrogen was used in the Pacific, and at the same time exposed its own soldiers to cancer, was also overlooked. Monsters were born for unclear reasons. Funny, but neither the atomic bomb nor the phosphorus or hydrogen bomb was banned. There have been voices that it is evil. It has tremendous destructive power, but precisely because of its effectiveness that's why useful. These voices have been erased. Joseph Rotblat, a Polish engineer from Warsaw, of Jewish descent, also worked on the bomb. Also known for movies. His escape from Poland was famous. He quit his job as soon as he found out what it was for. He suffered great harassment, including being accused of espionage. He eventually fled to Britain, where he founded the Atomic Scientists Association, fighting the arms race and nuclear. The fact is that after what happened, he tried to correct his mistake. Although Einstein warned him not to cooperate with the Americans, but this was his idea. Everyone forgets who fought so hard for the Manhattan Project and believed that America should overtake Germany in the arms race. Albert Einstein. I would blame him more than Oppenheimer. A madman who finished off his own family, and without the publication of his first wife's theses, he probably wouldn't exist. After the war, Oppenheimer was the chief advisor to the newly formed Atomic Energy Commission and used his position to fight for international control of atomic energy and to prevent an atomic arms race with the USSR. Because of his views on the matter, as well as his pre-war strong ties to the communist movement, he was denied access to secret state documents during a public political trial in 1954. When communist was needed, he was used. When he stopped being a puppet to follow orders, he ended up like Rotblat. Science can be evil. Cybernetics is the most dangerous nowadays. Replacing people with machines. At the same time, states tell us to give birth to children so that there are pensions for future generations. However, if technology continues to develop as it develops and machines replace us, there will be no work. This childbearing will create masses of hungry unemployed. No, not everyone will be president and politician. It is also propaganda, very low, because in the contributory countries everyone pays their own contributions from their salaries. That the state spends it on something else, so in fact, it robs the citizen. Another thing. From these ideas grew also in vitro and cloning. There will be a scream again, but work on these projects began in places such as Ravensbrück where, through insemination, the population of the Aryan race was to be increased at an express pace. Even special brothels were set up specifically for this purpose. This knowledge, like transplants, saved many powerful SS men because they simply sold it. Mengele, like his family, today absolutely did not consider those he studied to be people. They were not in his mentality. In medicine, there is such a cool term, research object. It's worse if the medic sees only a research object in the patient. Then the limit is crossed. This allegedly helps to distance oneself from the patient's plight. Certainly, until the doctor's psyche is warped with a sense of divinity. Statements such as, science has no moral dimension. Science should have a moral dimension. It is not politics, and science without morality can recreate what we saw in World War II. Manipulation after the war more and more penetrated the world of science, also thanks to money, as well as the Cold War. When both sides brainwashed people how bad it is on the other side. It's different. Some things are bad and some are good. Just scientists receive so-called grants from the governments of their countries, or worse, foreign countries. And they work on project, but of course, as the government wants, they present it as this government wants, even if it may turn out to be harmful to humanity in the future. The publication of books is also subject to these laws. A scientist who is not related to any current or a writer will not publish a book, because even if the publisher decides that the text is good, there will be no sales. You have to go with the flow. At the beginning of the 20th century, the fragmentation of knowledge reached a critical level. It was noticed by Hermann Broch, which he called the disintegration of values. The struggle between scientists reached such a level that all values created over the centuries began to be destroyed and no conclusions were drawn from it. Broch, unlike Jung, who was so admired, was aware that the multiplication of specializations leads to the fact that rationalism begins to crack, turns into madness. So it happened. People began to turn to more and more bizarre mysticisms, sects, cults, not realizing that a very good cult was at hand. A much safer cult for themselves. Just go back to it. A man in some situations becomes a demiurge, in others a blasphemer. But if someone accepts the reality created by someone else and does not shape it, he even follows it thoughtlessly without asking questions, he becomes a slave. A free, often unconscious slave. The best example of confirmation of this thesis is the laboratory. The scientist conducts an experiment. On animals, elements, people. The blasphemous tries not to be influenced by his experiment, even when he uses immoral methods, all in order to achieve the effect consistent with his assumption. It does not respect any legal restrictions. In a way, we invent machines to wash our hands of what Yeats calls the mud and blood of humanity. This distance from reality is very convenient, especially when the effect can be terrifying. Do we lose our humanity this way? In a positive sense, yes, but it reveals the true nature of man. The one made of mud. Have you heard about it? This is a famous psychological test, which ended terrible. People had no idea what they were getting into. It got completely out of control. Those who played the role of prison guards finally began to torture. Another famous study. This woman was stabbed, raped several times. People were to do what they wanted with her body. No boundaries have been set. A good scientist also puts a piece of himself into the experiment. Trying to be part of the experiment. In theory, these good scientists will challenge their evil invention. He submits to the changes that may occur and takes responsibility for them. There are fewer and fewer of these. He acts in harmony with nature and knows when to stop. Of course, it is blasphemy. Because no one asks these animals if they want to be killed, according to science. It's not even a higher good, because it never talked about exploiting living beings on the assumption that they would die. Anyway, animal drug testing is not adequate, but human testing has been controversial since World War II. If people want a drug, they should sign a paper and test the drug on themselves. Not like in recent years that, under the guise of defending the world, people have unknowingly participated in vaccine trials. It was the greatest blasphemy in history, on a massive scale. Just like orphans in orphanages in the 19th century and early 20th century were used for research. Of course, it wasn't only Catholic circles who did it, as they try to make you believe. Stayed also Protestant as well. That was the system. Children really started to have rights after World War II. Orphans are still used in many countries. I am not a supporter of IVF and will not be, if it will gone in that way. They will start screaming again that their genes. They're not sure if it's their genes, and those genes are really fun. About them in another meeting. There was a famous case in America of a doctor who inseminated his sperm and produced several hundred children in this way. I know what in vitro is. In veterinary medicine it was much earlier than in human medicine. Just like insemination. You know that famous horses are bred by in vitro and insemination in horse surrogates to keep their shape. These mares do not give birth to their own foals lest they lose their shape. Maybe that's the point. We have millions of children who need homes or orphans, and many countries, even in the developed ones, will end up with one thing. They will have to stand on the wrong side of the law to survive. Let's clean this up. Then we can talk about IVF. Let orphanages disappear. Sure, breeding cows, those for shows as well. Let European women in their emancipation think that they will not deceive nature and let grandmothers not be mothers. Then they will save a lot. Doctors, play it of course. There's a lot of money behind it. Choosing the color of the child's eyes, hair. It's starting to feel like picking an item off the shelf rather than actually wanting to be a parent. Children are not supposed to be perfect. They are the beings of tomorrow, not yours. As Gibran wrote, I don't like this approach and it's dangerous. Using animals for organ production, which no one asks them about. Sorry, but in the Middle Ages a pig who mauled someone had the right to a lawyer in a trial. Contrary to appearances, she had more to say than today. So is the imposition of human organ donation. This is to be your decision. You don't want to give it away. All this was invented by medics from the camps who sold their knowledge to the Americans. Some people may not like it, but it is the truth. It started there. Check out some university textbooks on the period, or books written by authors at the university. After all, they must care a little more about the truth than an author who comes from nowhere. All this brings living beings to a cog. Cartesian empiricism triumphs in medicine, as does self-deification. It is common to replace and even manufacture organs, like spare parts for a machine. It is also common to produce children like robots. Proponents of this process often forget that it can become dangerous, and integration and synthesis straight from hermeticism enters science. Fields such as biochemistry or biophysics are nothing more than a return to the sources. Science itself is in fact hermetically synthetic, although education is reluctant to integrate knowledge. The school cannot imagine combining art with philosophy and religion, although these fields very often show a synthesis. Theoretically, the teaching system is supposed to lead to a deeper understanding of more knowledge. The culmination should be the university. In practice, however, we have less and less educated societies, and the university is not universal at all. On the contrary, it multiplies specializations, rigorously divides knowledge and does not allow crossing the line, and topics that are intermediate areas are often omitted. At the same time, there is a total effort to destroy independent thinking and drawing conclusions through rote learning. The effect is just like that. Due to the fact that people are taught from the beginning not to think for themselves, they follow the flow mindlessly and do not ask questions. It has always been convenient for a weak power that was afraid that someone wiser could overthrow it. Let's not delude ourselves that school is the first instrument of power we come across. It shouldn't be like that, but it is. Schools are politicized in every system. There is one more effect. Modern societies, although they have more and more subjects, are more and more stupid compared to their grandparents, who may not have had outstanding diplomas, but they did have knowledge. How to explain it into layman's language, contrary to what psychologists say? The human ego is immutable. It takes on more and more of itself, and then it can be blown up but retains its original configuration. More explored cities of sexual conquests, adventure goods. If one merely collects and does not try to absorb experiences, one allows his ego to open up to the experience behind the circumstances and environment in which he finds himself, then he becomes a pilgrim, not a snapper of buildings to show off. Technology is a magic circle, but even a simple virus can destroy it. From a safe distance, we conduct experiments, research on chemical weapons. We delude ourselves with a sense of greater freedom, when in fact we are becoming more and more submissive. How much data must be entered today when we want to log in from another computer to our email? Companies tell us it's for our security and then we read that a hacker broke their security. This is phishing. Modern cities are less prepared for snowfall than the 19th century, because the governing lamp must go on. Worse. What happens when there is no electricity and you are in the store? You won't buy anything. Now imagine a power outage in an entire city or country. Chaos paralysis. People will kill each other at the first crossroads, because they are just used to the lights. Although they have the rules of driving on the course, they don't remember about it. As a result, we live in a bubble and take absolutely no responsibility for life. So modern mothers are crazy about their children who's in effect not even knowing that there is death. They are not to hurt themselves, not to play with the dog, watch out for strangers, at the same time children at school are drugged, for example with toilet cleaner. Well, like someone writes for a mother how scary the dog is. He also writes how to get high for children. The trick is to scare everyone. It has been known for a long time that the terrified will not oppose the actions of the authorities. It is also good to remove food from the shelves. Even if there is enough food. You can throw it in the woods or burn it. You can also make it stay in storage. People standing in lines for food. They have a job, and then the authorities do what they want. There is one more ground. Do everything so that there are no authoritatives and a good family. People without strong roots are much more susceptible to manipulation. Therefore, everything must be done to separate parents from children, and even better, to make these children stop thinking. The more power declines, the more it interferes with family life, and this applies to any system. Of course, nowadays it is impossible to completely erase basic skills. So let our children sign an employment contract, but they don't have to understand it. They are supposed to fuel someone's purse and budget. In this respect, we have indeed returned to the Gilded Age. There's not much on TV, especially on weekends. Once while I was sitting with the dog, I just flipped through the channels. I stopped at some news channel featuring a professor from Iran. Anyway, well-known man. It was in English, so probably not their TV. You say it's better not to say it. Well, this is the first and probably the last statement that I agree with the Iranian professor. I probably won't repeat it word for word, but this man really was saying something interesting. The 19th century was disgusting, but in the 20th century people exceeded all standards. We had 2 brutal wars, thousands of murdered, mental and physical cripples, war machines that had never been seen before, we beloved killing, tasted blood like never before, and created everything for it. Nothing mattered, and all filth ruled. Neither side was sacred. After World War II, there were actually 2 superpowers left in the world and countries had to take sides. At the same time, after all that had happened, none of the political systems had an answer for people how to live on after all this. People experienced so much horror that the authorities did not know how to make them realize that they could return to normal life, although it could not be normal after all of that. So alternative means were sought to divert thoughts from reflecting on the past and the meaning of life. However, the authorities were aware that there was no sense of existence for such a person. So they began to say that if he buys the 100th TV set, changes the furniture, he will be happy. In socialist systems, the same thing happened, but of course on a smaller scale, because there was no such production, so a distorted sick work ethos was added, which also did not bring such happiness. The spiral was on. The battered generation began to disappear, but systems still had no idea about the answer at the most important question, and the young became obsessed with acquiring goods to achieve happiness. All values were negated more and more, because the systems started trying to find new answers when the old ones were good. Possession has become a human value. Suddenly came the pandemic. It doesn't matter if it's political or not. Those gods who thought that the 100th TV would make them immortal and make them happy discovered that they would die anyway, and the 100th TV would not bring happiness. After being bombarded with all these news of death, they were even sicker, so often alone in home or lonely in home. Because they discovered that the man next to them, met in this rush of possession, did not suit them at all. They have nothing to talk about, and that is the basis of a relationship really. What's worse, people know perfectly well that the perpetrators were not punished as they should have been, on the contrary. Once you can agree with Stalin, in order to hide cooperation, huge money was pumped into them to become a power again. It showed that with influence and knowledge, nothing will happen to you. Everyone needs to heal now. They wouldn't have to if we didn't try to deny mortality and pretend that what happened in the 20th century didn't happen and that the value of humanity was not the TV. The words may not have gone exactly that way, but it really stuck in my mind. This man summed up the 20th and 21st centuries. There is a saying in Eastern Europe, possessed by mammon, they don't put it in the barrow anymore. It cannot be denied, even if from Iran. No, we can't take anything. Yes, we created monsters. We've even created mental illnesses we didn't know about before. Rostov vampire. Perfect example. People wondered if he was a victim of the Western or socialist system. He was everyone's victim. Defense of the Rhine and what was going on there, the Holodomor. Another Rostov. It's time to purify the one who wasn't a vampire, but became a Hollywood vampire by mistake. If anyone hasn't heard about what happened during the defense of the Rhine, let him read it. The Allies were not saints either. My grandmother's mother's brother went with them because he was taken prisoner by the Germans. He was like a veterinarian and they took him with them. He also had adequate memories of rapes and looting. Propaganda says otherwise, but it slowly stops. War drives the economy great, but it also takes off the masks. There is no more hypocritical, deceitful part of the history than the Second World War. Not only because we do not yet have opened the most important archives, Russian, British and American, completely open, but also because it was followed by huge propaganda from all sides. Unfortunately, elementary books. Instead of listening to an ordinary gray soldier, write about the mountain. Like that actually always happened. Is need at least 200 years, then objectivity appears, but not always. If someone has become a national hero, the state will do everything to ordain him, even if there is no one sacred. Manipulation is making something happen. Manipulation is everywhere today, as Goebbels used to say. Propaganda is the most powerful weapon. Wars are won before the gun is fired. He was the greatest propagandist in history. The 21st century was to surpass him, thanks to many worthy predecessors who, unfortunately, have been born again. Show trials of a few butchers, and not of influential founders, politicians or high-ranking people, are by no means a settlement.